All right, following on our discussion of Wordsworth's poem, Lines Composed a Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey, I want to talk today about landscape paintings of the first half of the 19th century. We've seen in Wordsworth's poem that there's a belief that landscape can have a profound impact on an individual, the experience of landscape, that is, and not only provide pleasure and delight, but also solace, restoration. Uh, Landscape might, Wordsworth says, influence one's moral behavior, and most importantly, provide transcendental experience, intimation of spiritual and divine truths. Some of these same themes we're going to see in the paintings that I'll look at. So let me bring those up. We're going to talk about 4 or 5 landscape painters of Germany, France, and in the United States. And the first of those is Caspar David Friedrich. Caspar David Friedrich, who lived between 1774 and 1840. A painter that's not very well known or represented in American museums. There is no major Friedrich painting in an American museum. And only in the last 2 or 3 decades have there been exhibitions of Friedrich's art in this country. As your textbook tells you, he was from the north of Germany, the town of Greifswald, which was then a part of Sweden. And the landscape there is rather chilly and bleak on the edge of the Black Sea. At the age of 16, Friedrich began studying with a local drawing teacher, and then entered the Academy of Art in Copenhagen, where he studied for 4 years. Ultimately, he would settle in Dresden. He was devoutly Protestant and strongly influenced by the writings of Gotthard Kossegarten, who wrote what were called prayer sermons. Kossegarten held that spiritual experience could be found in the contemplation of nature. God was manifest, he said, in the book of nature. And he refers to nature imagery, which comes specifically from the northern German landscape. And this is the very landscape then that Friedrich painted, and in which he locates symbols of human experience and divine presence. So the work we're looking at on the screen, this is in your textbook, and this is entitled Abbey in an Oak Forest, dating from 1809 to 1810. I talked earlier today with all of you about the term abbey, as in Tintern Abbey in Wordsworth's poem. An abbey is a monastic church, the monastery being governed by an abbot. Now, in this case, the abbey church is all but gone. What we see is a rather modest Gothic fragment that contains one stained glass window. The glass is gone. We see only the tracery, the mullions, and the tracery that would hold the glass in place. And you can see there's damage there. And it is located exactly in the center of the painting and framed symmetrically by oak trees, which are old. They've had branches and even areas of trunk broken off. They look like they could be dead, but it is winter, so we can assume that they are simply dormant in winter, and that they will spring new leaves in the springtime. The ground is covered with snow, and there appears to be here a funeral procession of dark-clad monks moving through the remains of the abbey. There's evidence here that this is a graveyard, and there are some crosses and tombstones, which are scattered about, and in some cases tipped to one side or another. So all of this imagery has to do with death. The scene looks natural, more or less. I think the symmetry of the composition suggests that there is some deeper meaning to be perceived here. Now, a couple of motifs that the textbook discussion does not mention, but which are, I think, highly significant. One of those is the veil of fog that conceals our perception of the distance. We can see dimly things in the foreground, but then there is fog or cloud here that obscures um, any recognition of things beyond. And I think this is intended symbolically. It indicates that beyond death, we don't know what will happen to us, what exists, what prospects lie out there in the future beyond our mortal lives. We can only guess. Um, and yet, if you look in the sky, another motif that is not mentioned in the textbook discussion, there is a sliver of a moon, a bit of light up here. And I think this suggests to me, uh, um, I think it's functioned as a kind of hopeful motif, that there might be something we can identify with the light that lies beyond um, the our our dim notions of the future, and it's up here in the heavens, a place that we might associate with the beyond, with an afterlife. So this is a painting that is about the nature of human experience, and really the large questions we might ask about human experience. Within what larger context does it exist? What might lie beyond it? These are traditionally religious questions, and yet you'll notice that there is really almost nothing here connected with religion. Yes, the monks are religious personages, and yes, there is a Gothic ruin of the church, but um, I don't think the painting is certainly not religious in any traditional sense. I want to show you a few other works by Friedrich. This is reproduced in your textbook as well, and it's called Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog. And this is like a number of his works. I'm going to show you a couple others. Here on the right-hand side, we see a woman contemplating the landscape in a similar way. This motif of a standing figure gazing upon the landscape, a figure who we see from behind, this is common in Friedrich's work, and this figure is called, in German, a Rückenfigur, Rukkenfigur, Rückenfigur, a wanderer or a halted traveler who pauses to gaze upon the landscape and seemingly to contemplate the deeper meanings that it might hold in a kind of thoughtful way. Because we see the figure from behind, I would argue that Friedrich intends for us to imagine ourselves in the position of the figure. That is, the painted figure is a kind of a surrogate for us, an invitation that we gaze upon the landscape and think about its deeper meaning as a kind of corner of creation, as being immanent with the presence of God. The male figure is somewhat incongruously attired in street clothing, and yet here he is in a position that would have taken great effort to reach, and these are not the kind of clothes that you would put at risk in climbing up to a difficult, rough promontory. The female figure holds her arms out in a way that subtly suggests an embrace of the landscape. And you notice that the lines of her arms connect with the ridges that are seen in the distance. This is a woman before the setting sun is a title, and that setting sun lies behind her. Another example. Here we're looking at Woman at the Window by Friedrich. I don't seem to have a date on this, but I'm guessing it's about 1815. And here we see the same kind of figure, that is a Rücken figure, but within a domestic setting. Somebody who has paused in her movement throughout the house in her daily work to look out the window and to gaze upon the landscape beyond in a kind of moment of thoughtful contemplation. You'll notice that there's almost nothing here in the way of furniture or furnishings. there are a couple glass containers sitting here on this shelf, and that's really it. Now, it seems to me that we might think of this little niche in the wall of a house as a kind of chapel-like space that might extend off the side wall of the church. We can liken the shelf to an altar, and even the open shutters to a triptych, a painting that has lateral wings that open and close. And above, the mullions in the window um, give the shape of a cross. So there's a lot about this that suggests a kind of space and the objects that one might find in a church setting, though we're clearly not in that sort of place, but rather within a house where during her daily work, her daily chores, the woman gazes out across the broader landscape in a moment of thoughtful contemplation. And then one final work by Friedrich, which is called The Stages of Life. Here in the foreground, notice the technique in all these is very naturalistic and very meticulous. If we could see the actual paintings, there would be little evidence of brushstrokes. All of the forms very precisely drawn. Lots of detail within the work. So in the foreground here, we see a family group, and it consists of a father figure with his children playing with a flag, and next to them is their mother, presumably. I think this is a logical, plausible reading of the painting. So they form a family group, and we might imagine the figure here closer to us in the foreground is is the grandfather of the children, a family figure from an earlier generation, and he moves more slowly out to this location, and the father figure turns while standing protectively over his children. He looks back to ensure the safe movement of his parent out to the edge of the rock. Beyond, there are boats, and there are the same number of boats as the figures. Notice that there are two small boats here within this bay-like or cove-like setting, and then three larger boats that are out in open water and move further and further away. So I think clearly we have a design here that that suggests an analogy between the boats and the human figures. The small boats stay closer to shore. They don't venture out. Of course, they are analogous to the children. Then the larger boats are analogous to the adult figures who move in a kind of journey out across the water, across open sea. But the final destination for the distant boat and for the grandfatherly figure, the elderly figure, is unknown. The stages of life. Let me back up and say here, so we might regard these paintings as an example of what I'm going to call spiritual landscape. That is, they're landscapes that prompt questions of the larger meaning of life, life within the setting of the landscape. The landscape contains signs and symbols of things like death and rebirth that prompt these kinds of questions. And yet notice that the iconography is not traditional Catholic iconography. There's no Jesus, there is no symbol of the Trinity, but rather trees and boats and sky. All right, the next painter we'll look at is John Constable, one of the two very important English painters of the first half of the 19th century, Turner being the other one. They were almost exact contemporaries, born only a year apart. Constable lived between 1776 and 1837. He was the son of a prosperous miller and landowner in the east of England. The family hoped that he would take up the the family business, but Constable persisted in his desire to become a painter, and finally, fairly late in life, in his mid-20s, I think, he embarked seriously with the family's support on a career as a painter. His models were Dutch Baroque landscape painters like Jacob van Ruysdael, but also Claude Lorrain, the French painter of classical landscapes. But in addition, there is in Constable a scientific, uh, deeply observational basis to his paintings. Um, Constable made oil sketches on the site. This was fairly new, a fairly new practice. Painters had previously made drawings on site, um, but oil paint was not available until the mid-19th century in the tubes in which it is typically placed today, making it convenient to use. You squeeze out as much as you need, and that's it. So that in Constable's time, it was necessary for a painter um, to mix up his own paint, to prepare his own paint, and then to make it transportable. And what they would do is to put it into pig bladders, and that made it possible to carry oil paint into the field and to execute small scale oil sketches, which Constable did as a basic part of his painting practice. Now, some of these sketches were of the sky. As your textbook tells you, Constable was something of an amateur weatherman. He would go out of doors and make small scale sketches like this, in which he would try to record as accurately as possible the appearance of the sky, the shape of the clouds and their seeming movement, and he would record on the back of these paintings the time of day, the wind direction, the kind of clouds that he saw. Here is another example. So these are highly naturalistic, made on the site, small scale studies of clouds, which then would serve him as mnemonic aids back in the studio. And a painting like this, one of his most famous, this is called the Hay Wain, dates from 1821, would be then the culmination of lots of small scale studies, which would be assimilated into a large scale work like this. He called works, his final works of this size, his 6-footers, because they were roughly 6 feet in height or in width. This is 50 inches by 73 inches in length. That is basically 6 feet. Now, what do we see here? The title, The Hay Wain, refers to the wagon, which in this case, in contrast to what your textbook says, is not loaded with hay, but is being driven or pulled by horses across a shallow spot in the Stour River to the fields in the distance where the hay is being raked. You can see a hay stack over here. So the wagon will be loaded once again and the hay transferred to a storage location. That's the principal motif. But in addition, there is a cottage on the left-hand side. There's a dog. We have sketches of this very dog's pose by Constable, which here he has assimilated into the foreground. The dog looks into the space of the painting at the hay wain, and so kind of invites us to do the same thing. There is a fisherman over here. You can see him right here, a pole sticking up into the air and a boat that's drawn up into the reeds along the water, and the workers in the distance. So that's about it. One of the things you'll notice about this is the little touches of white that lie along many of the leaves. Constable referred to these jokingly as his snow and sleet. Well, they're not really. What they represent are the touches of light, the bits of highlight that fall from the sun onto the edges of the forms in the landscape. And so they suggest the play of the light, the passage of clouds overhead, the changing atmospheric conditions, the process that exists within the landscape. Your textbook tells you that at this time in the countryside, to get rid of that. What the heck? Let's see here. There was unrest in the countryside. I'm trying to get rid of that over there. All right, there we have our image again. Unrest in the countryside. The Industrial Revolution was going on. Farmers were not making enough money to survive. There was dislocation of people from the land. And so there were outbreaks of violence and destruction. Constable does not show any of that. Constable's politics were conservative. So this painting is rather nostalgic and idealized in its depiction of people living in harmony with the landscape. Landscape is peaceful. People are going about their work in a way that seems calm and purposeful and absolutely constructive. We're looking here at a category of aesthetic experience that was given a label about this time in aesthetic writings, and that is the picturesque. Literally, that means picture-like, but it was used to describe landscape scenes which were somewhat rough and irregular, and where you would see things like hay wains and the shoreline and the weeds and the rushes and stones along the shore. There's a roughness, a ruggedness to this that was labeled picturesque. One other work by Constable I'll show you is this, called Dedham Vale. Now, in its basic composition, this has the design of a classical landscape with trees that frame a view into the distance. And there are also focal points that in foreground, middle ground, and in the far distance. In the foreground, there is evidence here of dislocation and hardship. Because what we're seeing is a little, kind of gypsy encampment or an encampment of homeless people. There is a tent that's slightly reddish. And here's a woman who's bent over a child, and there's a little bit of smoke coming from a fire. If you look directly above, then we see a bridge across the Stour River again, and mill buildings. Their red roofs then link foreground to middle ground, and in the background is the tower of the church in the town of Dedham, and it's surrounded by the red roofs of buildings in the city. So these reddish forms link together and invite us to read the painting from foreground to middle ground into the distance. So while these things suggest a classical landscape, as we would see in the work of Claude Lorrain or Poussin or maybe Nibali Karachi, notice that this is a landscape that the weather acts on with some force. You've got here a blasted tree in the foreground. It's battered and twisted, and trees that here too seem blown about by the wind, and a storm that is moving toward us, it would seem, with dark clouds and streamers of rain coming from it. A classical landscape then that is animated by the forces of the weather. Again, with touches of white, Constable snow and sleet that suggests light on and process and change within the landscape. Constable's near contemporary, Joseph, my Lord William Turner, Joseph Turner, lived between 1775 and 1851. Whereas Constable never left England. Initially, he traveled to the conventional beauty spots of England, like the Lake District in the north, but gave that up, gave up chasing beauty secondhand, as he said, and settled in the agrarian country of East Anglia and London, not far away. In contrast, Turner traveled widely. He went over the Alps several times. He went to Italy. He traveled on the continent. He traveled seeking out and painting foreign cities, grandiose landscapes, and extraordinary landscape effects like storms and fires. It said he once tied himself to a ship mast and he vowed that if he survived the experience, that is the ship going through a storm, that he would record what he saw as vividly as possible. I show you the work on the screen, which is called The Passage of Mount St. Godard, dating from 1804. This is a pass through the Alps, and this is an example of Turner's um, search for grandiose sights in the landscape. Uh, and this is an example of what I would call the sublime. Now, as we discussed in the Zoom meetings, the sublime, as defined by Edmund Burke, the philosopher, was a kind of aesthetic experience which leads the viewer or the recipient to uh, have feelings of awe mixed with terror. Um, and if we were literally here, afraid for our life, we might feel only terror, only fear. But because we experience this in a painting, alternatively, it might be, in film. It might be on the cinema screen. It might be through music even. Um, we were aesthetically removed. We're physically removed from the experience enough that we can experience a little bit of fear, but also awe, pleasure. And Burke contrasts this with what he calls the beautiful. The beautiful we might equate then with classicism and a classical landscape or ideal landscape. This is a very different kind of landscape. You'll notice that we're looking at a chasm within the Alps. We can't see the bottom of the chasm. We can't see the top of the cliffs. So the landscape seems limitless. It seems gargantuan in its depths and heights. It's also obscured by clouds or fog, which limit our ability to comprehend, to understand the landscape. And there is a path here along the side of this cliff that looks extremely precarious, and you can see a couple load-bearing mules that give a sense of scale. They are tiny in comparison to the immensity of the landscape as depicted. So this is a painting that exemplifies the sublime. That is, things that overwhelm the viewer and that give rise to feelings of terror mixed with awe. The painting in your textbook that exemplifies this in a more narrative way is this, which is entitled The Slave Ship. I want to, it had a subtitle that I want to read, and that is Slavers Throwing Overboard the Dead and the Dying, Typhoon Coming On. The Slave Ship, Slavers Throwing Overboard the Dead and the Dying, Typhoon Coming On. It dates from 1840, late in the career of Turner. As your textbook explains, this was apparently prompted by the reprinting of an account that had first been printed in 1781, which described in an incident specific to the slave trade, that the captain of a ship realized that the ship was in danger of sinking, or at least some lives on board being lost, and he had a lot of slaves who were being transported from Africa to England, to Liverpool specifically, on board. They were sick. They were, many of them, dying. And knowing that he would be reimbursed for the loss of those lives if they were lost overboard due to a storm, but not if they died during transit from illness. And so he threw about 50 of the slaves overboard. An act that was reprinted because it was an example of the cruelty, the barbarism of the slave trade. And Turner here has painted this such that we see bodies, we see legs and arms sticking into the air. You'll notice that there are chains, manacles around them, There are also large fish, which suggests that something like whales or maybe sharks are consuming the bodies of the slaves thrown overboard. In the distance is a slave ship, uh, and it looks tiny and quite fragile in relation to the size of the waves and the storm that is erupting here. Um, so the subject and the prospect of this storm, which threatens the destruction of everything, not just the slaves thrown overboard, but also the ship itself. Um, this, I think, conveys the sublime as well. Um, it's a it's a scene of violence, of cruelty, of instability, of potential, actual and potential loss of life that makes us feel revulsion, but I think also fear and maybe some awe. Now you'll notice the technique is like nothing we've ever seen before. Um, the um, the the colors are extreme. They they don't seem to describe what we might see in the sky. Maybe sunset colors, but they seem almost apocalyptic, as if a divine punishment is being imposed on the ship for the inhumanity of the captain. There isn't a straight line, really. Well, um, perhaps the mass of the ship only, but otherwise not a straight line in the landscape. It's all diagonals. It gives a sense of instability. In the paint, a lot of it is applied with a palette knife, that is scraped on in a way, particularly in the middle here. And I've got a detail to show you. Very rough painterly application. So a lot of this paint doesn't really describe anything, but rather it functions as pure paint uh, with its color, with its roughness, eliciting emotional experience from us, um, which makes this a very powerful painting, but also one that looks ahead to the free use of paint and color in an expressive way in the later 19th and 20th century. On the screen now, we're looking at the work of Thomas Cole, an American painter. Cole lived I'm looking for some dates here, a, uh, a life of some brevity. As I recall correctly, it's about 1802 to 1840, something like that. 1801 to 1848, okay. Cole was born in England, but came to the United States early in his life, and he is regarded as the leading painter of the Hudson River School. Now, these were painters that shared a common interest in landscapes up and down the Hudson River, although some of them traveled more widely, even across the United States. Uh, and um, and we see the wildness of the landscape in many of their works. We certainly see the grandeur of the landscape painted in a way that invites the viewer to contemplate its beauty and its meaning. This work is entitled The Oxbow, and subtitled View from Mount Holyoke, Northampton, Massachusetts after a thunderstorm. It dates from 1836. A large painting about 4 feet by 6 feet in size. If I were to ask you what aesthetic categories we see here in the way the landscape is represented, picturesque, sublime, the beautiful, I wonder what you would decide on. I'm going to suggest to you that we see really two. You'll notice the painting is divided roughly in half. And on the left-hand side is a rugged, wild landscape that looks like it would be difficult to pass through. And there is a storm, dark and threatening overhead, which is blasting the landscape, especially this tree here in the foreground. Whereas on the right-hand side, the landscape is filled with sun. There are no clouds overhead. The landscape has been domesticated. It's the place of farms, and you can see a bit of smoke coming from a building or two. So this is a tame landscape, a human-occupied landscape. I would call this the beautiful. And on the left-hand side, I would call the landscape one which elicits feelings of fear and awe, that is the sublime. So there's a transition right in the middle of the painting. The title refers to the river. That is the Connecticut River, I believe. And it's flowing around this big curve, which is an oxbow. Now, what will happen in time is that as the river goes around this curve, it's going to eat away at the land right here before the water is forced to turn. And as it comes back around, it eats away at this bank as well. And over time, then the river will cut through the oxbow, and what you'll have is then a remnant, a kind of arc shaped, crescent shaped remnant. If you look at maps of the Mississippi River, you could do this on Google Maps, you'll see that all down the Mississippi River, particularly in the south, there are remnants of former oxbows. So this is a motif that suggests change in the landscape. The landscape is something dynamic that is always changing. Of course, in addition to going through the seasons, and which is an annual cycle of change. We could call the oxbow then a cycle of geographical change. And the storm then is part of a cycle of daily, even hourly change. In the foreground here, we see the operations of a painter in a tiny motif well, here there is a painter's stool, and there is a parasol which is closed up. Looks like maybe some supplies at its base. And here is the artist himself. This would seem to be Thomas Cole, who has a painting or drawing on an easel. We can just barely see that, but he looks back toward us. And so this painting, it's generally interpreted as a kind of invitation for us to contemplate the landscape and the way the landscape of upstate New York, but even further west, especially toward the west, was being changed by development, by settlement, by agriculture. Civilization was encroaching on the landscape. The painting asks us then, what is the future of the American landscape? To what extent do we want it to change? Do we want to preserve wild places? Cole used the landscape again and again to ask these kinds of questions, political questions, spiritual questions. And I want to show you a cycle that he worked on, which does this on a larger scale. He completed, and let me find a date for this if I can. I don't see a date, but it would be right around 1840. A series of paintings called The Course of Empire. And what it shows us is the same place as it changes over time as a result of both the forces of nature, but also the efforts of humans to settle and to develop the landscape. So this is the first painting in the series, and this is called The Savage State. I'll put the title down here, The Course of Empire, The Savage State. And that's followed now. By the way, let me, if you remember this motif here, so the mountain with cliffs on one side, a more gradual slope on the other, and this blocky rock at its summit. And here you can see the same thing, now a little toward the left, but this is called the pastoral or Arcadian state. And you'll notice that this takes us back to, something like ancient Greek times, but also maybe Neolithic times. We see a Stonehenge-like monument here in the middle ground. And this would suggest religious rituals, one of those things that humans develop as they as they settle a place and begin contemplating larger questions. Here is an older man who might be a philosopher. There are children playing. Here is the building of a boat on the water's edge, and there are shepherds, goat herds scattered about. So pastoral would indicate, of course, pasture. We've got here a primitive people living in harmony with the landscape, not changing the landscape very much. Now, a big leap to this, there's the mountain motif in the distance, and this is called consummation. Remember, the course of empire, consummation. So this is Cole's imagining of maybe the Roman, something like the Roman Empire at its height, with classical buildings of grand size. This looks a lot like the Parthenon, 8 columns across the front. Monuments to gods, to emperors. It also looks like there's affluence and indulgence here, which maybe hints at decadence and a decline of things in the future. Here is a leader who's processing across this bridge in the foreground with many attendants. And so what follows then is destruction. There is the landscape motif again in the distance. So it's relatively unchanged. The earth goes on, but human civilizations rise and they fall. Something has incited conflict, and all that was built up here so gloriously is now being destroyed. And the final painting sequence then is this one, which is called Desolation. Those seemingly permanent forms created by the human occupants are now falling into ruin, being reclaimed by nature, being covered up by plant growth. There is the same mountain motif in the distance. It's all becoming wild and natural again. So a series of paintings like this would invite viewers to ask, well, where are we in this cycle? Are we rising? Are we still developing in a positive way? Are we declining? Are there worrisome signs that we should think about and try to correct before we suffer the same fate that has befallen these people? The last of the artists that I'll mention here is Albert Bierstadt, who was born in Germany, but immigrated to the United States and is associated also with the Hudson River School. Bierstadt lived between 1830 and 1902. He traveled west and is known as a painter of the Western landscape. And so you're looking here at the work, which is in your textbook, entitled Among the Sierra Nevada Mountains, California, painted in 1868, just after the Civil War would have ended. A big painting, 6 feet by 10 feet. And this celebrates the grandeur of the Western landscape by showing a scene that is entirely natural, though I would say idealized. It is, I think its grandeur, its magnificence is somewhat exaggerated. A placid lake, ducks are taking off here in the foreground. A deer stand at the water's edge. There's a forest over here, no stumps, except for the one in the foreground, which seems to be natural, which would indicate human impact on the landscape. A waterfall coming out of the mountains and then falling magnificently into the water. Here, the same kind of thing, and over here. One thinks of Yosemite National Park, and then precipitous cliffs and snow-covered peaks in the distance. But the light cascades down through the clouds, and in the words of the textbook, it suggests a heavenly consecration of the land. That the magnificence of the West is something God-given, and there for those that can see it, to appreciate and to marvel at. Your textbook suggests that this has something to do with the concept of manifest destiny, which was first described in the middle of the 19th century. And this held that The destiny of the United States, of American civilization, was to spread over and to possess the whole of the continent which Providence has given us for the development of the great experiment of liberty and federal development of self-government entrusted to us. Well, this is a kind of self-serving prediction, um, which glosses over the fact that the landscape was being despoiled by construction of railroads and mining, and that native peoples were being displaced. Um, those that were developing the West wanted to encourage Western travel, Western settlement, and those developers were maybe most importantly the owners of the railroads. And it was the owners of the railroads that commissioned paintings like this and collected them. But that all stopped. And so what I hope you've seen is that um, that landscape in the early 19th century was quickly becoming an important category, an important subject in the practice of many of the best artists of the time. And landscape was being used to raise a broad range of very serious questions regarding the validity of slavery, for example, um, um, the, the wonder of creation, um, the future of the United States, how far we should develop, what should we develop, should we keep something wild, as well as a subject in which intimations of the divine, of the spirit, and the human place in the scheme of things might be pondered.